Hello. It's just so good to be back. I love Xavier, and I can't believe how long ago 2013 feels. I was last here in 2016, and suddenly 2016 is also a really long time ago. When did that happen? So it's just so good to be back and sharing this presentation with you all tonight. So I want to start with a story about when I was a senior in high school. I went to Catholic school, and I was required to take a theology class every year. And that year, I don't remember much about the class that I was taking, but the one thing that does stand out in my memory is this experience I had on the day when we were learning about the sacraments, ordination specifically, and why it was just for men. And however it was that the teaching was explained led me, this precocious 17-year-old who'd never particularly doubted the radical idea of my own equal dignity, to raise my hand and ask, how does this not mean that I'm made less in God's image? While I don't remember exactly how he responded, my recollection of the interaction was that I walked away from my teacher's response knowing that I'd asked a question that wasn't allowed to be asked. And I didn't walk away feeling affirmed in my dignity or empowered as a co-responsible agent of the church's mission. So when I share this story with other Catholics, it's usually met with a sort of knowing nod. So whether on the topic of women's dignity or any number of other places where people find their lived experience to be in tension with church teaching, far too often, the response on the part of representatives of the church's authority has been to shut down the conversation completely, rather to engage with the tension. There are certain things that we know that we can't talk about, certain opinions that we know we can't have or at least claim publicly. There are certain shapes that our lives can't take unless we're comfortable incurring some degree of risk, right? Variable in size and severity, depending on our particular circumstances. A risk of being belittled, shamed, dismissed, even ostracized. It's tempting to put a nice narrative bow on my story that I shared and say that it was on that day that I learned that one such thing we can't talk about is the church's treatment of women. But if I'm being honest, I'm sure that I had already learned that lesson. I think it's a lesson that many of us who've been raised in the Catholic Church have learned. However, in the last few years, that has been changing. Since Pope Francis inaugurated this multi-year global synod on communion, participation, and mission in 2021, there has been an explicit invitation to the people of God, to all the baptized, to speak frankly about their experiences without censorship. It's come as a welcome shock, and a less welcome one to some for sure, to see many once taboo topics reflected back in official church documents that synthesize what's been shared in listening sessions that have taken place throughout the world, from LGBTQ inclusion to women's ordination to married priests to sexual abuse. Take this excerpt from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops' national report that synthesized listening sessions across the 16 regions of the U.S. Church. They wrote, there was a desire for stronger leadership, discernment, and decision-making roles for women, both lay and religious, in their parishes and communities. People mentioned a variety of ways in which women could exercise leadership, including preaching and ordination as deacon or priest. Ordination for women emerged not primarily as a solution to the problem of the priest shortage, but as a matter of justice. That's an official church document. That was pretty surprising. Or elsewhere in the same report, where authors acknowledge those who are marginalized because circumstances in their own lives are experienced as impediments to full participation in the life of the church. Among those members of the LGBTQ community, people who've been divorced or those who've remarried without a declaration of nullity, people who've civilly married but never married in the church. So naming these things out loud, I remember when this report first came out, I had multiple people be like, have you seen this? This is the church saying these things? So this shift toward listening is also visibly represented by the layout of the Synod Hall, where during this past October, over 300 delegates gathered for nearly a month to discern about the Holy Spirit's will for the church in light of the global listening that had taken place over the prior 2 years. So where past synods of bishops, you can see there on the top, have arranged themselves in auditorium-style seating, this synod took place in small groups seated around tables, with each person expected to share and, crucially, listen. Now, one little anecdote that I heard that I love, generally the content of these conversations in the Synod Hall was confidential in order to give participants the freedom to speak and to listen and to change their minds. But one thing that did make it out of the Synod Hall was just the facilitator saying, "Excuse me, Cardinal, she's not done speaking." Right? So that's different. The Synod has also included unprecedented participation of women. Not only have women been key drivers of listening sessions at the local level, but women have also, for the first time in the history of the church, served as voting members in the Synodal Assembly, charged with making recommendations to Pope Francis based on what has been shared during the various phases of listening. So while the various synthesis reports produced throughout the Synod process, they are official church documents, but they don't represent official church teaching, the very fact that they plainly name experiences and opinions that for so many have felt decidedly relegated to the realm of the taboo for so long, that's far from insignificant. And while the ultimate authority to implement changes proposed by the Synod rests with Pope Francis, it still matters immensely that among those informing his sense of the faithful are women. To me, this step toward transparency and openness is a remarkable source of hope, even as the church has a long way to go toward transforming structures and cultures so that at every level of church life, people feel free to ask questions, speak from their experiences, and exercise co-responsibility for the mission of the church. So when I was a student at Xavier from 2009 to 2013, I would not have predicted that I would be standing in front of you all tonight in this particular capacity, working for Discerning Deacons, an organization that's focused on the question of women deacons. Despite my question as a high school senior, or who knows, perhaps in part because of the way it was answered, women's ordination of any kind was never really my thing. I think it was due in part to the fact that I myself never really felt a call to any sort of ordination, priestly, diaconal, and partly because I had largely been shielded from any obvious impact of the church's teachings about women. I was raised an only child with no brother to compare myself to, with parents who never, that I can remember, communicated any explicit expectations about my life's trajectory that had to do with my gender. I had no trouble speaking up in class, and I didn't at the time perceive my gender as holding me back in any particular way. My mom was one of 5 daughters, all named Mary, very Catholic, in a household that it was devoutly Catholic in some respects, but it really just didn't have much to say about gender. As adults, my moms and my sisters were the family matriarchs. You know, we didn't end family gatherings by huddling up and like putting our hands in and shouting girl power, but I think that's really just because that's not our personality. Like, we're that kind of family. The women are really matriarchs, and so I think I couldn't quite see the need. But as I made my way into the world of ministry as a Catholic woman, I did start to accumulate some of my own experiences of gender-based marginalization and to understand more fully the bigger picture that wasn't limited just to my own experience. And in 2022, I found myself reading an email from Casey Stanton, who's one of Discerning Deacons co-directors, as I discerned an invitation to join the staff team as an organizer. And I want to share with you now several paragraphs from that email that Casey wrote to me, because I think they really capture the spirit of what we're up to at Discerning Deacons. She wrote, "My sense is this, that you have been prepared for this work. Along the way, we'll mess up, we'll have tough days, we'll need to rely on divine help and remember to keep the Sabbath each and every week with days of retreat to step back and refresh. We'll learn a lot, will weave relationships and dreams and agitate people to believe that they have more power than they realize when they start to exercise it collectively, especially in and around the impossible possibilities opened up around the body of Jesus. We'll try to remember that we're creatures and God is God, and all our labors are offerings, gifts, that this is work of discerning gifts and offering them up, of trusting in the promise and reception of communion, in which all are fed and nourished and held, and where our gifts are shared beyond measure. That is, that we should take none of it too seriously, ourselves most of all, because it's meant to be a gift, a source of joy and delight, even as we deepen in a struggle. We're doing something mystical and glorious, and also something ordinary and entirely possible, with feet on the ground, engaging real people in their real lives, and the reality of God's call within it all. As an organizer, you have to cut through the busyness, the lies and distractions we've all mostly filled our days with, the stories we've told ourselves about what's not possible and what we can't be. We'll get where we want to go by going all along the way, by teaching others the ways of prayer and action, of gifts and organizing, of a God made flesh and walking with us in struggles for liberation and bread. I think you've been waiting for permission to go all in, she told me, to see just what you might be capable of transforming with the work of your hands. I hope that we can be a part of your own unleashing. I was sold. I felt very seen in my dignity and summoned for mission. I wanted to be a part of that team that was in the business of seeing people and unleashing them, myself included. What I didn't realize at the time was just how aligned this vision was that so appealed to me, this vision of a common, irrevocable dignity, foregrounding a call to mission, just how aligned it was with what was emerging from the church in the Global Synod. So in 2021, Pope Francis called on all the baptized to journey together in a global synod on the themes of communion, participation, and mission. And this has been called history's largest listening session. Church leaders have been seeking to consult the entire people of God as a part of a discernment about the will of the Holy Spirit for the church in the new millennium. The synod would begin with local listening sessions in parishes and universities and religious orders, the most local level, and ultimately would culminate in a two-part gathering of a synod of bishops, which in turn would make recommendations to Pope Francis for concrete structures and organizations that would support the emergence of an increasingly synodal church, a church that is a listening church. That's what you can substitute when you hear the word synodal, a listening church. At the heart of synodality is an affirmation of a shared, universal baptismal dignity that is no greater for ordained than lay, for men than women. As the synthesis report from the October 2023 Synod Assembly puts it, part one of that two-part culmination. In Christ, women and men are clothed with the same baptismal dignity and receive equally the variety of gifts of the Spirit. We are called together into a communion of loving, non-competitive relationships in Christ, into a co-responsibility to be expressed at every level of the church's life. When the Synod launched, Discerning Deacons was only a few months old, and I wasn't working there yet, so this is background. But the then team of three got themselves to Rome for the Synod's opening mass. And there they met up with several women who had participated in the Synod on the Amazon, which a few years prior had called for women's ordination as deacons. So together, these women managed to land a few moments with Pope Francis, where they shared about the mission of Discerning Deacons to connect Catholics with the church's active discernment about women deacons, and to support Francis's recently announced synod. And they gifted Pope Francis, what you can see there, an image depicting St. Phoebe, the deacon, proclaiming St. Paul's letter to the Romans. And I'll share a little bit more about Phoebe in a bit. And Pope Francis's message for the team was firme, adelante, onward. And so that team of three, Casey, Ellie, and Lisa, they considered that as a blessing and a commission to go forth and to be the deacons the church needed to realize its potential for synodality. In the months that followed, Discerning Deacons went on to train a team of synod animators who in turn organized over 9,000 individuals into listening sessions during the first stage of the synod. And meanwhile, the stories began to accumulate of women who felt a call to diaconal service, many of whom served as de facto deacons, right? Doing all the things that deacons do without the title or the grace or the formal authorization afforded by ordination. And we heard stories about the communities that they served, the pastoral needs that they rose to meet, often despite considerable barriers. We also started hearing murmurings of a need for a renewal of the order of the permanent deacon on the whole, to not simply add women in stir, but to reimagine the entire process of ordaining deacons and unleashing them for their ministry of the word, liturgy, and charity. So now it might be a good time to pause and give a little background on the diaconate. So if you're anything like me, sorry deacons for what I'm about to say, until a year and a half ago, my ideas about the diaconate were somewhat vague and lackluster. I thought of them pretty much as lesser priests who can be married and who share some responsibilities with the priest during the liturgy if they're there, but if they aren't there, it's really no big deal, and do we really need them anyway? Here's something that I didn't know until I began working with Discerning Deacons. The permanent diaconate, as we have it today, has been around for less than a century. Prior to that, it had been hundreds of years, approaching 1,000, since the Roman Catholic Church had ordained permanent deacons. Throughout the Middle Ages, the diaconate was in decline, and it was all but obsolete by the 12th or 13th century. In the intervening years, up until Vatican II, the only kinds of deacons in the church were what are often called transitional deacons, so men on their way to becoming priests. This is part of the reason that we tend to collapse the diaconate into the priesthood, when they're in fact two separate and distinct orders. And the timeline for the decline in the permanent diaconate coincided with the reality in which, as a scholar, Mary Catherine Tillman puts it, quote, popes of the 11th and 12th centuries, as well as the Lateran councils convened late in that period, spoke out against women as women. That is, as impure by nature, defiled by the flow of blood and menstruation and childbirth. By the 1230s, women deacons were largely unthinkable in the West, end quote. So ultimately, with the eclipsing of the permanent diaconate, with the transitional diaconate, the pathway by which women could be ordained as deacons disappeared altogether, because women couldn't be transitional deacons, because it was what you did on the way to being a priest. But women did serve as deacons in the early church. So Discerning Deacons' patron, St. Phoebe, is one example. Phoebe was the person who St. Paul chose to deliver his letter to the early Christian community in Rome, what we now call the letter to the Romans. And it's a role that likely meant she would have been a key interpreter of the letter for the community as well. In his letter, he gives Phoebe a shout out, kind of the way you might write an email intro, recommending somebody you know to somebody else. He writes, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church at Cenchreae, who's been a benefactor to many, myself included, and I ask that you receive her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the holy ones and help her in whatever she needs. But some might say Phoebe wasn't a deacon in the same sense that men are deacons now. She wasn't ordained. By this logic, neither should we consider her contemporaries deacons in any meaningful sense, like St. Stephen, who's often considered among the first deacons. Ordination was a historical development that occurred after Phoebe's time. St. Phoebe would not have been ordained, nor would any of her contemporaries. But we do actually have later records indicating that women deacons underwent ordination rites comparable to those of their male counterparts. Women's ordination as deacons was not implemented everywhere and at all times, and it wasn't without its opponents. But there's clear historical evidence that it did happen, and it wasn't just like one time, and it was considered legitimate by bishops at that time. So let's jump back to the 20th century. In the aftermath of World War II, remember, we don't have permanent deacons at this point, people around the world were asking themselves how to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. And out of that, men and women began to organize themselves into deacon circles, which together retrieved this early charism of deacons in the church, which Deacon Bill Deitwig, I love the way he puts it. He says the deacon is to be the conscience of the church, dragging the ambo to the streets and the streets to the ambo. And they began to live this charism out in their communities while also advocating for the church to reinstate the office of the permanent deacon. And at Vatican II, seeing that these people were already doing the work of permanent deacons, church leaders asked themselves why they shouldn't be afforded the grace of ordination. And they reinstituted the permanent diaconate. And you can see that full quote there. I won't read it out loud, but basically just saying, these people are already doing this. Why shouldn't we give them the grace of ordination? So though it was as true then as it was now that there were women too who actually carried out the functions of the deacon's office, including women in the reinstituted permanent diaconate, was never seriously considered at the time of the Second Vatican Council. Though it's notable that at multiple points in time since, the door has been left open. So even as the church has clarified its restrictions on ordaining women as priests, it has not done so regarding the question of ordination of women as deacons. All of the papal and curial statements against the ordination of women specifically address the ministerial priesthood and priestly ordination, not the diaconate. In 2002, the International Theological Commission stated about women deacons, it pertains to the ministry of discernment which the Lord established in his church to pronounce authoritatively on this question. In other words, it's fair game for the church to discern this. It's something that the church has the authority to decide. Just as there were men at the time of Vatican II who carried out these functions of deacons, so too today women serve as de facto deacons. As Philip Vigano explained, women can perform all of the functions of the deacon insofar as they're authorized by their local ordinary. They can administer baptism. They can reserve the Eucharist, distribute it, and bring it as viaticum. They can provide benediction with the Blessed Sacrament. They can witness and bless marriages. They can administer sacramentals, officiate at funerals and burials. They can preach and preside at worship and the liturgy of the word in the absence of a priest. They can carry out the works of charity, administration, and social assistance in the name of the church. They can promote the apostolic activities of the laity. Not only can women perform these functions, they do every day in every territory, end quote. So just a few examples here on the screen. Sister Celia Meath in the top left corner is one of a handful of women who serve remote communities in the Amazon and who, with the blessings of their bishop, carry out diaconal functions like administering baptisms and witnessing marriages. Sister Elizabeth Young in the bottom right corner serves rural, often indigenous communities in remote Australia, or Jennifer Kelly in the top right corner who ministers to people in prison in Seattle. So by the same logic embraced by the Second Vatican Council, is it not time to offer women who are already doing the work of permanent deacons the grace of ordination? That is a piece of the discernment that is on the table right now. That's part of the question. So that raises the question, what difference does ordination make? Right? If they're already doing it, why do they need ordination? Part of what we hear over and over again from women in ministry is the need for their ministries to be stabilized. Ordination would stabilize ministries that currently expand and contract at the whim of individual leaders, right? We all know the story, those of us, especially who've spent time in parish life, this happens a lot, of a woman who'll spend 20 years, right, building up a ministry just to have it toppled with a flick of a pen after a change in leadership. And this creates whiplash, of course, for the woman, but also for that community that she'd been serving. Ordination would also give those who are already serving in diaconal ministries formal authorization to minister on behalf of the church, which in some contexts is necessary for people to serve as ministers at all. For example, in certain prison systems, chaplains have to be ordained. and thus those in those systems do not have the opportunity to be ministered to by a Catholic woman. Ordination would also allow women's voices to be routinely heard from the pulpit during homilies offered at Eucharistic liturgies, a role that's technically reserved for ordained people. Though certain priests and bishops do find ways, often with a lot of acrobatics involved, to incorporate women's voices at the pulpit now. But how do we work so that this isn't an exception that depends on the goodwill of an individual who might be taking considerable risk? Ordination would also quite simply offer women access to sacramental grace who are currently doing the work of deacons without it. Sometimes people, often themselves ordained, will say, if women are already serving as de facto deacons, why do they need to be ordained? But if we truly take seriously the sacramental grace of ordination, we're going to find ourselves approaching the reality of women's service as de facto deacons without ordination quite differently. Finally, to ordain women as deacons would be an affirmation on the part of our church that women can image Christ. According to the United Nations, 10.3% of the world's women live in extreme poverty, and 1 in 3 women experience physical or sexual violence. Here, scholar Phyllis Zagano asks, what can the church do about the fact that women are denied their humanity, their rights, their livelihoods, their freedoms, and in too many cases, their peace of mind, and even their own lives, end quote. The present contradiction implied by a church that proclaims that all are made in the image of God, but that only men can image Christ, props up a culture of male supremacy that perpetuates violence against and subjugation of women. So this question about women deacons, it's also cracked open another question about the permanent diaconate as a whole. In part because its current iteration is so new, again, only since Vatican II, it's still super unevenly implemented around the world, with some dioceses ordaining deacons and others refraining from doing so. And also because for so long, again, the only kinds of deacons were men on their way to being ordained as priests, our popular imagination tends to conceive of deacons as lesser priests, rather than as individuals ordained to a separate order with a distinct charism to draw out the diaconia of the entire Christian community. So diaconia is often translated as service, and that's a significant piece of what this means, but there's some nuance to it. And I want to share some of the thought of a scholar named Deacon Bill Deitwig here, who contrasts 2 schools of thought regarding the significance, the meaning of this diaconia, this thing that grounds the ordination or the vocation of the deacon, and to which the deacon calls the rest of the Christian community. So Deitwig contrasts these 2 schools of thought, and the first one, which has been given a lot of weight historically, originated, I just lost my place, let's see. It originated with Hermann Bayer and Wilhelm Brandt, and they understood diaconia primarily as humble service. Quote, something to do with waiting or attending on a person, service that was common, ordinary, nothing special about it, and that the service involved menial tasks, unquote. The influence of this way of thinking remains predominant today in deacon formations and things like that. A second school of thought is that of scholar John Collins, of whom Deitwig writes, quote, where earlier scholars had focused on the humble service of a waiter, Collins put the waiter in motion, an agent who bridges the kitchen and the diners. This service is less about humble service than it is about the action of the go-between, unquote. Ultimately, Deitwig suggests that we should understand diaconia as a both and. He writes, the longstanding tradition of the church consistently sees humble service as part of diaconia, something that all Christians are called to in virtue of baptism. Even as an emissary or a go-between, someone needs to exercise his or her mission with humility. The emissary, after all, is not speaking their own message, but proclaiming the message of the one who sent him, unquote. And Deitwig goes on to further nuance this vision of diaconia when he writes that deacons are supposed to see things that other people miss and see them as Christ sees them. So our tradition holds that the office of the deacon was created by the early Christian community when it came to light that widows were being left out of the daily distribution of the community's resources. Deacons were to see those who were not being seen and to assure that they were not overlooked and that their needs were taken into account in the administration of the community. Later, this particular role would take the form of deacons serving as the eyes and the ears of the bishop, helping to keep the pulse, as it were, on the flock. And diaconia, understood in this way, as humble service, bridge builder, eyes and ears to those who are excluded, it's inextricably intertwined with synodality, which looks to transform the structures of the church so that the experiences of all the faithful, and particularly those on the margins, are taken into account in the taking of decisions in the church, and so that all of the baptized are truly co-responsible for the gospel mission. In the 2023 Instrumentum Laboris, which is the name of the document that set the agenda for last October's gathering in Rome of the Synod of Bishops, it asks this question: walking together with the poor and marginalized requires a willingness to listen. Should the church recognize a specific ministry of listening and accompaniment for those who take on this service? How can a synodal church form and support those offering such accompaniment? How can we give ecclesial recognition to those bearing an authentic vocation to contribute to a just society and care for our common home? So it immediately struck me when I read this paragraph that the functions that are described here are ones that have a lot to do with an existing ministry, the diaconate. Although the degree to which the lived experiences of deacons reflect the ideal here, it varies wildly from place to place. But could it be that what the church needs in order to fulfill its vision of synodality is a revitalization of the permanent diaconate that restores it to its prophetic roots and includes women in its ranks? These were stirrings there were stirrings along these lines at October's Synodal Assembly in Rome. So these are just some of the ways that discussions of the diaconate came up. You know, they talked about the uneven implementation of the permanent diaconate around the world. In the case of the folks who were gathered at the Synod, a lot of them didn't even have deacons in their diocese. So Synod delegates called for an assessment of how diaconal ministry has been implemented since Vatican II. And they acknowledged the need to really understand the diaconate as its own thing, as not just lesser priests, right? And suggested that as part of rethinking diaconal ministry, the church should promote a stronger orientation towards service to the poor. And on the question of women's access to the diaconate, the Synod delegates called for deeper theological and pastoral study and for the results of previous papal commissions on the topic to be made available. So I want to share with you one of my absolute favorite visions of the diaconate. This is a gem from a 3rd century text, the Didascalia Apostolorum, the teachings of the apostles, about how many deacons a given community needs. It says, the number of deacons should be in proportion to the number of people in the congregation. There should be enough so that everyone is known and everyone is looked after. Can you imagine a church like that, reinvigorated in its service to the margins by a diaconate restored to its origins, one that includes women and men, that animate the spirit of diaconia at every level of Christian life? What difference would that make? If every person, no matter how marginalized, not only felt known, but co-responsible in shaping the life of the Christian community, in living out the universal call to diaconia, what difference could that make? I got a glimpse into an answer to this question last fall when I had the immense privilege of spending 5 weeks with my Discerning Deacons team in Rome during the Global Synodal Assembly. While we were in Rome, we attended public-facing Synod events. We served as a bridge to the Global Assembly for our communities back home, many of which had just celebrated the Feast of St. Phoebe the Deacon the month prior. And we sought to bring something of the spirit of diaconia to the Synod itself, much as the post-World War II Deacon Circle sought to do at the Second Vatican Council. And we carried stories of women's diaconal ministry that illuminated a vision that answered the questions raised in the gathering's agenda-setting Instrumentum Laboris, which asked, is it possible to envisage women's inclusion in the diaconate? We brought stories that suggested an answer to that question. And we shared those stories and that vision of a prophetic synodal diaconate that goes out to the margins and includes men and women with Synod delegates during a symposium that we hosted at the Jesuit Curia down the street from the Synod Hall. That's us, our team after it. It was close to the press, so we didn't take pictures of the delegates because we wanted people to feel free to be there without it being like a political statement. But this is us afterwards at the bottom. And we also prayed. I spent the first of my 5 weeks with 15 other young adults, 14 of us women and 2 men, who together comprised Discerning Deacons Young Adult Synodal Pilgrimage. And we prayed. Several weeks before we departed for Rome, one of the young adult pilgrims, Joanne Lopez, you see there the arrow pointing to her, she shared a vision that had emerged in her own prayer life of all of us praying together over Synod delegates. And her vision became our vision. Throughout that first week of the Synod, anytime we'd run into a Synod delegate on the street, we would let them know who we were and that we were praying for them. We'd ask for their prayer intentions, and then when invited, we would gather around them and we'd extend our hands over them and we would pray. These moments, cardinals, bishops, laymen and women serving as voting members in the Synod in this historic first, all bowing their heads as 14 young women and 2 young men prayed aloud over them. These moments were saturated with grace. I would hear that grace come back to me over and over again in the month ahead. When I would, I hung around for 4 more weeks and I'd run into Synod delegates and they would whisper excitedly to me in these brief encounters in the Vatican streets, it's working. And they weren't talking about any particular outcome. They were talking about the possibility of forming a beloved community in a church that's far from immune to the polarization that rocks our society. This way of being a church that listens, especially to the margins, it's working. I want to share another vignette from my time at the Synod, also from that first week there with the young adult delegation, where yet another diaconal saint wove his way into our story, St. Francis of Assisi. One of the first things that we did in our pilgrimage was attend the first official public event of the Synod, an ecumenical prayer service in St. Peter's Square. And for this service, they carted in the San Damiano cross from Assisi. And Assisi is home to one of the few saints that's so beloved across Christian denominations, St. Francis. And this cross, which you can see there on the screen, it includes depictions of members of the Christian community surrounding Jesus. And it's famously associated with St. Francis because it was at the feet of this cross in a dilapidated San Damiano church that St. Francis received his vision from God, calling him to rebuild my church. And the legend goes that St. Francis took God to mean this literally and set to work restoring the Church of San Damiano, which you can now visit in Assisi, and only later realized the broader scope of this call to rebuild my church, the universal church. And it was really a remarkable symbol to have before the Synod delegates as they prepared to spend a month seeking to do just that, to rebuild a church that in many ways is limping, fragmented, wounding. I later learned that a full-size replica of the cross was placed at the entrance of the Synod Hall so that Synod delegates walked past it each day. Rebuild our church. For our own part, our delegation would have another rendezvous with St. Francis and his cross when we made our way a few days later to Assisi on the eve of St. Francis's feast day. So that's a couple of our pilgrims with the cross there in Assisi. This man whose life was such an embodiment of diaconia joined St. Phoebe in my imagination as a patron of our journey. And I would continue to think of St. Francis and his legacy of peace throughout the month as the Synod unfolded against the beginnings of the since unceasing violence in the Holy Land. And as I heard story after story of Synod delegates experiencing true conversion, the turning of their hearts toward one another through encounter, something started to crystallize for me. Synodality is a project of peacemaking. When Pope Francis was appointing people to the Synod, he appointed his friends, but he also appointed some of his biggest critics, because what he was interested in doing was getting all of the sides of a polarized church in the room to sit with each other and have a transformational experience and encounter. The Catholic Church didn't invent this way of being together. Women religious have been carrying out similar processes for centuries. Many Native communities have similar practices. I could go on, but it's remarkable that an institution as far-reaching and as powerful as the Catholic Church is seeking to operationalize a process like this so that every level of decision-making throughout the church is informed by encounters with the faithful of all stripes. And I can't help but think that in a world as polarized, as often violent as ours, if those Catholics among us, all 1.36 billion of us, if we got just a little bit better at staying with each other through our differences and disagreements, long enough to see one another's humanity and for a new way forward to emerge. In a world as polarized and as violent as ours, I can't help but think that that would matter. And not just to Catholics, but to our entire human family. That is what synodality is about. In this moment in church history, we're seeing this huge shift toward embracing what Pope Francis likes to call co-responsibility. In this way of being church, all of the baptized are co-responsible for the church's mission. And the work of the Synod is to ask how our structures can facilitate that co-responsibility, which is born, again, of our shared baptismal dignity, no greater for the ordained among us than the lay. And the possibility of a church where power flows through structures of co-responsibility, that is a sign of hope for me. And I believe that prophetic and synodal diaconate, renewed for the church's social mission, that includes men and women, is part of how we get there. So the question before us today is not simply, should women be deacons? We need to dig deeper, and we need to go beneath the surface with our questions. What do we need deacons for? What is the vision and the current witness of deacons that inspires this? Where are the signs that it already is? Who are the witnesses of the diaconate that inspire and ground our steps as we seek to have the church recognize and receive this witness? We learned earlier of the work of Sister Syria Mies, Sister Elizabeth Young, Jennifer Kelly. I'm sure that each of us can come up with at least one example, if not several, of women and men whose lives bear witness to a prophetic and synodal diaconal ministry of the word, liturgy, and service, a ministry that goes out to the margins, that minds the gaps, that sees those who go unseen as Christ sees them, and brings the concerns of their heart to the decision makers whose choices impact their lives, that unleashes others as a co-responsible protagonist in bringing about the reign of God in the world today. It's important to note that this is not a competition, it's not a zero-sum game. Concerns that ordaining women as deacons would necessarily undermine lay ecclesial ministry or displace male deacons reflect the sense of scarcity in our vision of ministry and what God is up to, the gifts that God is pouring out for the building up of Jesus's living body on earth. I believe that this discernment about diaconia and who we authorize to animate it among our communities is one of the most important ones of our age. And whether it dies on the vine or flourishes and renews our church is going to depend on how we bring this conversation into our own communities right now. It's up to each of us to prepare the ground for this shift so that if church leaders leap and make this decision, there's ground to land on, fertile soil to take in and nourish the seeds of a church renewed by the diaconia of women and men. So I want to leave you with the words that Casey gave me when I first joined the team at Discerning Deacons. My sense is this: you have been prepared for this work. I think you've been waiting for permission to go all in, to see just what you might be capable of transforming with the work of your hands. I hope that we can be a part of your unleashing. Thank you.
This is time for questions and conversation. I should say to those that are joining us on Zoom, you have a question. Better get to that on the way.
Oh.
I'll talk about. And we can repeat the question, so I'll make it okay. One of the things when you start wondering, either for those that are opposed to more active role for women, when we started listening to all these heroes, they threw out this apostolic letter that both John II affirmed. That's almost like the first argument that you hear on it. And yet there are some scholars and theologians that have made it clear that you do not consider that as binding to the point of infallibility, which is what they argue, simply because it's very questionable whether such teachings have been constantly preserved and applied in the tradition of the church. And I'll move on to this.
Yeah, there's the letter from Pope John Paul II. So, I mean, when it comes to the diaconate, he's not talking about the diaconate. It's like the most straightforward. That's one of the several examples since Vatican II where the church leaders could have included the word diaconate in what they were writing and they didn't. So that's, as it pertains to this conversation, that it is simply not actually applying to the diaconate. It's talking about the priesthood. Yeah.
You could go back.
If you don't mind, so the Zoom folks can hear it.
You could go back and be your high school teacher. What would you say to yourself now? Because here's my context.
You're a high school teacher, yeah.
At an all-girls school. And I have a question. I would say the church is not there yet.
Mm-hmm.
But in your life, sense change.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you'll get in trouble with their studies.
Yeah.
What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? This is one of those things, like I was saying at the beginning, there are certain things we can't say. There's, especially if you depend for the church on your income. And I think I would say that's a really good question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. We are going to have a little bit of time to practice a synodal conversation in the spirit. If you all just don't have any more questions and you'd rather chit chat with each other, we can transition into that before too long, but I won't rush. I know it can take some time to percolate. Yeah.
How optimistic are you about the future?
What I'll say, yes, is so when I got back from Rome, a lot of people were like, do you have hope? And I could tell that what they meant was like, do you have hope that in October 2024, women will be ordained as deacons? To which I would say, like, some recent developments suggest, I think, that the timeline is probably more like 2025, where that would be most likely to like crystallize. The things that would need to happen for that to be possible are happening. And there's still a lot of work to do. There's still opposition. I think there's a real question right now of, are we going to ordain women as deacons? Are we going to create a separate thing that's not ordained of deaconesses? I think that's part of that's why I ask, what difference does ordination make? So I think what I said when I came back from the Synod is I have a lot of hope, and it's not contingent on whether this particular outcome happens in 6 months. And I do have a lot of hope that, again, the things that would need to happen, Pope Francis was just meeting with Anglican women, it's women from another faith tradition that does ordain women, and these were ordained women, asking like, how did you do it? Like, the things that need to happen in order for it to happen are happening. And what Synod delegates have communicated in conversations that I've had with them, that members of the team have had, is like, there's no going back. But I do think the question of like, are we talking about women getting ordained is real. And that's part of why it's really important that we have those conversations and ask, what difference does ordination make? Yeah. Or
You go first.
Oh, I just have a question about how you guys are trying to make it more acceptable in the US. Women being deacons, because I know that the church in the US is a little more restrictive or kind of more, fussy about certain topics, or just having women in position. What are you doing to stand in the face of that diversity?
Yeah, it's interesting because the US church is quite, oh, sure, yes, of course. The question was around, and the mic's behind you if you want to repeat it.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. I was just asking what the Discerning Deacons are doing to kind of, gosh, what was my question? My line of question, I'm forgetting. But basically, it was about how are they standing in the face of adversity in the US, in the parishes here, and because the parishes here are known to be a little more fussy about certain topics, or just having women in certain positions in general. So what are they doing to make that space a little bit open? And also, how do you get involved with the congregation so where they feel like having women in possession, they are secure?
Yeah, thank you. That's an awesome question. Part of what's interesting about the US church is it is very polarized. Like, something I got some insight into while in Rome, talking to other people about the US church, is like, we really have a reputation for being very polarized in the church. And so it is true that there are people who do really oppose this sort of thing, but there's also, more so than in many other places, pockets where women are preaching, for example. So but part of what I love about Discerning Deacons is we are very intentional about staying inside and walking with the church. And it's partly because it creates a path for those places where they don't have women preaching already to begin to have the conversation. And so really practically, something that we organize every year, I love that you asked this question because it gives me a chance to plug this, is we organize St. Phoebe celebrations. So parishes, universities, like basically any Catholic organization, we invite to celebrate St. Phoebe's feast day anytime in the month of September. Her feast day is on the 3rd, but it's like, Xavier's not back in session yet. So, or maybe you are, but that's a bad time for it. So sometime in the month of September to celebrate her feast day as a way to, first of all, like, give people an experience of having the word broken open by a woman, whether that's, a homily at a liturgy of the word, or offering a reflection at the end of Mass, just something. So many people have never heard, like, never seen a woman at the pulpit. So to give people that experience, to pray through St. Phoebe's intercession for the Synod and to connect people with what's being discerned in the Synod, and to grow the awareness about Phoebe. Like, nobody's heard of Phoebe before. But within that, we really we're organizers, we're community organizers. So we really walk with people to like be in relationship with their leaders. And we want to find a path that your parish can walk. And that might not look the same as what another parish can walk, but how to start where we're at and really begin to grow the conversation with what we have. And it's relational is at the heart of that. Yeah. Yes.
Kind of along the same line.
Maybe can you use the mic for the Zoomers?
Hi, just along that same line. If anyone's ever listened to anything that's happening on Discerning Deacons, atmosphere, you seem to be fired up because of, just like you're a wonderful speaker and everything on there is. Would you be able to elaborate just a little bit on specifics that the Discerning Deacons is doing as we head into the Synod in October? In addition to thinking you did, of course, but I know it can be monthly prayer services, things like that everybody can get and, you know, be a part of it. How exciting it is.
Thank you. So we do have monthly prayer services on the 3rd of every month. So again, St. Phoebe's feast day is the 3rd. So we were like, we're just going to do it on the 3rd of every month. They're hosted by different kind of local groups who maybe have celebrated Phoebe, who wherever there's just like 4 or 5 people who've got the energy and want to host it. So this coming one will be hosted by some folks in Arizona. And then after that, it'll be hosted by our women in the Amazon that we're in relationship with. And the month after that, some women in Australia who you met, one of them. We also on April 29th are going to be hosting a giant virtual symposium for Synod delegates and all of you and all of your friends, everyone you know, to come and really dig into this vision of a prophetic synodal diaconate of men and women that goes out to the margins. Because what we've heard from Synod delegates is what they really need right now. They need stories that illustrate why this is necessary, right? One of the things they call for is pastoral research. There's a lot of the bookish research that's already been done, but they need stories that illustrate this. So we're gonna share, keep hitting this mic, share some stories about, in a lot more detail than what you heard tonight from the people themselves, and share this vision so that they can have a practical thing that they can take with them to the Synod, because they've said that that's what they need. And so we are organizing folks to bring their people. If you wanna like help pull that event off, we're gonna be having some training calls for our leaders who will help facilitate conversations in the spirit, and really just like driving, like bring their people. Like this is, if you've ever been to a town hall before, it's not a town hall, but like it matters to have a good presence of people there that says, this matters. It's not just something like 3 people care about. So that's our big thing right now is how do we get our people, how do we get our clergy, our priests, our deacons, our decision makers in that room? And then we can use that to turn and start to have the conversations about, so how about Phoebe Day? So that's the plan in the next couple months. Thank you. Yes,
So one reason why.
might need the mic for the Zoom. Yeah.
One reason why the discussion of women deacons at the Synod didn't go as far as many hope is what you said is that some parts of the world have not really implemented permanent diaconate.
Mm-hmm.
And they were like, what is this question that we don't even know permanent deacons at all?
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, do you know of such organizations as Discerning Deacons in other parts of the world? I think it would help if this push was coming from different directions, not only from the US church, especially since we don't have great reputation in the world scene.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know of any other organizations like that in other parts of the world?
Yeah, so in Australia, there's a group called Liturgy on the Margins that Sister Elizabeth Young started, which is the group that I would say sort of similarly hyper-focuses on the diaconate. But what we are seeing a lot of is like networks of theologians from different regions gathering around this question. Some of it's just murmurings, so I don't want to like start name dropping everything that I've heard on that front in terms of specifics. I can say that Latin American theologians during the Synod released a proposal about the diaconate, including women in it, something that was really concrete. So I'm hoping that we're going to see more of that. And I know that there are conversations happening in different parts of the world with like groups of theologians around that. Yes.
I'll try to talk a little.
I think it's so the Zoom folks can hear. So Just wait on the mic. Yeah.
Okay. I'm really interested in how you see the movement for women deacons influencing the movement for women priests. And do you think it's like, in a way, if women are ordained as deacons, it'll, in a funny way, transform the male priesthood somehow? Or, I mean, do you see, I know there are groups working for women priests as well. So what is your relationship to those groups, and just how are you looking at the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think so Discerning Deacons exists with a really particular focus on the diaconate, in part because there are, like you said, several other groups that focus on either women's ordination broadly or women priests specifically. And for the folks who, started Discerning Deacons, part of the experience was women who feel a call to the diaconate need a space to also talk about that, because the priesthood tends to suck up all the air in the rooms. So we focus really specifically on the diaconate. I think there's a lot of different opinions about, if women were ordained deacons, what would that mean for priests? Frankly, it's something that a lot of people in the church are really afraid of, that it would be a slippery slope to ordaining women as priests. So it is definitely something to navigate. But there's no doubt that the relationship right now between ordination and decision-making in the church, I think Pope Francis is really complicating a little bit. And I think he's trying to tease apart. There's all of these things in our church that you have to be ordained in order to do, that you shouldn't have to be ordained in order to do. Ordination has been way too tied to authority in the church. And the priesthood, especially, that's part of why the diaconate faded, was because it was sort of vying, the diaconate and the priesthood were vying for power, and the priesthood kind of won. And so I do think that what we'll see is a continued interrogation of how we ascribe authority to ordination. And I'm curious what that'll mean for, whether that'll take some of the charge out of the conversation at all. If in 50 years, there's not as much power in decision-making that comes with being ordained, will it be easier to have these conversations and make some of these decisions? So yeah, it's a good question.
Let's try one more thing. And you were very candid earlier. I think we talked about we have to get the ground ourselves for this, and there's chances that we have to do that, but that's not happening. You're talking to kind of people who do that.
That are what?
We're kind of afraid of it going all the way to the priesthood. That's so the oversight line. But right now, I'm talking about my wife, for example, another woman that have gone through the lay presider program, that are allowed to do prayer communion services. They're allowed to do go to interment or do a morning prayer. And I've seen firsthand where someone is woman in that role, in this look, and then afterwards say, "Oh, gee, that was nice." And I don't know why more women don't come in and get that training, because I can say that I know my wife was trained even during the term of our current bishop, but so I think there's opportunities there, and that's kind of seeding the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like I said at the end, it's sometimes it can be framed as a zero-sum game. Either we need to develop new lay, strengthen lay ministry, or we should ordain women as deacons. But doing one would decrease the possibility of the other. And I don't think that is by any means necessarily true. And that a lot of these opportunities that we already do have, it's the glass ceiling is here, but we think it's here. And there's actually a lot of space that we already have the freedom to inhabit differently. as women in the church, but we think the glass ceiling is lower than it is. So do we want, it's 8:15, so you tell me what we should do. Okay, great. Let's, I just want to give the last like 15 minutes to give you all an opportunity to talk to each other, and to practice a synodal skill. So I said I was in Rome. To be clear, I wasn't like a voting delegate in the synod. Sometimes when I talk about this, people think that I was among the synod mothers, the first step. No, I was there to bear witness to what was happening. We heard that at the Second Vatican Council, some of the juiciest stuff happened outside the walls. And so we were like, we want to be there. But we did hear a lot about what was happening. And every day they use this method called Conversations in the Spirit. We're going to do like a lightning round of it right now. But this is an opportunity. We're going to have 2 rounds of sharing in, let's do trios. And the first round, we'll ask you each to take a turn sharing on the question, when you imagine a church that has revitalized the ministry of diaconia by ordaining women to a diaconate restored to its social justice mission, what difference would that make for you? So everybody shares once. There's no crosstalk. There's no like, oh my gosh, me too. This is the type of thing that in a perfect world, we would have prepared and prayed ahead of time and kind of come ready with what we were going to say. And I will sing a Taizé song. If you know it, you can sing along, but that'll be your cue that that round is over. And then we'll move into round 2, which will have the same structure. So everybody shares once. And listening to others, guided by the Holy Spirit, where did you notice resonance or tension in yourself? When did your heart burn within you? Okay, so we're gonna have, we'll have about 6 minutes per round, so 2 minutes per person to share in groups of 3. And with that, I would invite you to get into a group of 3 and share.